Let's get started. My name is Rita Larkin. I'm with the Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation, and I'm here today with Dr. Ann Mitchell Whisnant. We're very happy to have her here today. Ann is a professional historian and director of the Graduate Liberal Studies program at Duke University. She and her husband also run the public history consulting firm Primary Source History Services based in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. In 2006, UNC Press published her book, Super-Scenic Motorway, A Blue Ridge Parkway History. And she has also written another book with her husband, David. It is for children. It is titled When the Parkway Came. So these are just a few of her career milestones. There are many, many more. But we're happy to have her here today to talk about Black history on the Blue Ridge Parkway, places, stories, and new research. So I will hand it over to you, Ann.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rita, and thank you to all my colleagues at the Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation for hosting this today. If you'll bear with me a moment, I'm going to start my screen share, and my colleagues can tell me if this shows up the way I mean for it to, which hopefully it will. Let's try that. Okay, colleagues, are we seeing the main slide, Black history on the Blue Ridge Parkway, Rita?
Yep.
Okay.
You're all set.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming today. And of course, now I've gone ahead before I meant to. I wanted to introduce this by saying that this presentation came about partly because I'm pretty active on social media, as my friends know, and last fall with the pandemic in place and working from home, my husband David and I went out on a fall day to go up to the Blue Ridge Parkway and spend some time. Being outdoors, of course, felt safe, and it was something that we could do. And so we ended up at Dalton Park, where we spent some time exploring around the site that you see here on the main screen, which is the site variously known as the Woods Picnic Area, or Picnic Area Number 1 at Dalton Park. This is an area immediately behind what is you know of now as the Bluffs Coffee Shop. That site came later, it was developed later. And this picnic area was developed in the late 1930s and early 1940s before the coffee shop, and was by 1941 designated as an area for Black visitors to the Blue Ridge Parkway to use when they came to the Bluffs. What was called the Bluffs then. Whites were allowed to use what is known as the Meadows picnic area, which is the picnic area that you may be familiar with today. If you go up past the lodge, that direction, but Black visitors were supposed to use this area. If you visit the Parkway today and go to Dalton Park, you would never know that this site is there. There's no signage that tells you about it, and unless you go down some very inconspicuous steps behind the coffee shop and wander around through the woods, you wouldn't see it at all. And its story is not well known to many, although I will say that National Park Service research reports have talked about it on and off since at least 1997. And the park sponsored a short specific research study in 2009 that focused on Black history and segregation in the history of the Parkway by Rebecca Jones. And so some of what I'm going to say today is drawn from that study. So anyway, point is, some researchers have been aware of this, but the broader public is not. So I went up there in the fall with David and I posted this picture to my Facebook page, and that has then led to me being asked to speak with you today. I will say that these are some pictures that I took of the site in 2008 when I first visited it. As you can see, it's grown up even more than it has. It's grown up over the years even more since 2008. I will say that this is something, if there is one thing that my 2006 History of the Blue Ridge Parkway, the book that I published with the University of North Carolina Press, does not pay enough attention to, it is race and Black history. I'm a white scholar. I ran into scattered materials about this topic, mentions of it during my research, but not a large trove of materials. And honestly, I will say I didn't have enough framework myself to understand the references and to think about what was going on at the time. So it's something that it's a flaw. A book is a snapshot of what you know at a particular moment, and I didn't know enough about this to take it up, but it's a super important topic, and it has been threaded through much of the other work I've been doing since then, and it is time. It's time for me to pay attention to this. It's time for the Blue Ridge Parkway and the public to pay attention to it. And I will say that in the 15 years since my book came out, there has been a lot of other work. I mentioned Rebecca Jones's 2009 study for the Park Service, but lots of other work is going on all over the place on Black history and on national parks history now. We're having this national conversation about race. And so it seems like a good time, and there's the material there and the framework there to support work on this topic. So as I think about a lot of that reading that I've been doing, it seems to me that there are 4 possible approaches or kind of buckets into which you could put research and interpretation, hopefully on the Parkway, that is related to Black history along the road. And I'll say, I'm going to make some suggestions about the kinds of things that could be talked about in each of these areas, but I really want to emphasize that I am not currently engaged in a major research project on this topic. I've been away from Blue Ridge Parkway work largely for many, many years. And so what I'm going to say is really more speculative and suggestive than it is definitive. It is, or these are some ideas for some directions that we researchers, historians, and the park could go in. So there's 4 big areas that I think are worth focusing on. And I'm going to talk about those in turn. The first is about Black history in the Parkway region writ large, communities, institutions, life and work, and often cemeteries. And, you know, there are places to talk about this. The second is the National Park Service's own work planning for Black visitors. This would be everything from National Park Service policy to the planning and development of facilities to travelers' experiences on the Parkway. A third area of focus could be Black labor on the Blue Ridge Parkway. This could cover everything from the Civilian Conservation Corps, and I'll talk about that later, to work for contractors building the road, to employees of the National Park Service, including park rangers. And then finally, a fourth area that needs attention is related to ideas of racism, actions related to racism and white supremacy, and how those are also woven through the Parkway's history. Anyone who knows me knows my work, knows that maps are my favorite thing. So I did play a little bit over the weekend with creating a map that I could imagine that would identify locations on the Parkway where, if one were disposed to create interpretive materials or to have a tour or a virtual tour or a brochure or signage or anything else, these are places where you could easily talk about Black history in these 4 areas that I mentioned on the previous slide. I played a little bit with this, and this is a static view of a Google map that I created, and I did color code so that you could see areas and locations to talk about each of these topics in history. Could be Black history before the Parkway, NPS planning, Black labor, racism, and white supremacy. But as you can see, Black history could be talked about all up and down the Parkway, as our little dots show, and this could easily be elaborated with more time. So the first area, Black history in the region, both before the Parkway and during the years that the Parkway has been there. It's important to pay attention to the fact that when the Parkway was created, and ever since then, and even before that, there has been an idea about the Appalachian region, or Appalachia, as being basically a white region. And there's a lot of conversation about that and things we could say about that. But the most important point that I want to make here is that Appalachia is not an all-white region, just is not. And that idea is not sustainable. It wasn't sustainable 100 years ago. It's not sustainable now. And particularly, we can talk about in regard to the history of slavery in the United States. There was slavery in every Appalachian county, and thus every Parkway county has histories of slavery. Enslaved people across the mountains where the parkway now lies were involved in all kinds of work, including tourism in the early days, and also mining. In North Carolina was an important area in the mountains where enslaved laborers worked. And there has been quite a bit of research in the past 10 or 15 years. Scholar Wilma Dunaway has been important on this front, talking about how important the Appalachian region was as an area where the domestic slave trade flourished. There were many routes by which enslaved people were trafficked across the Appalachian Mountains and then on to other parts of the South. So those histories are there. By the 1930s, when the Blue Ridge Parkway was proposed and construction began, I have some data from the 1930 census that reminds us that there were large and significant Black populations in many of the Parkway counties. And I've listed here some of the counties in North Carolina and Virginia that had a large percentage Black populations. As you can see, in general, the percentage Black populations were larger along the Virginia Parkway counties than in the North Carolina Parkway counties. But of course, in particular, I should highlight Buncombe County, and this is the area where Asheville is, has always had a significant Black population since the founding of the city in the late 18th century. So there is Black history everywhere, even though the planners of the Parkway were very enamored of the white idea of Appalachia. And I've talked about this some in my previous work, in that much of the early cultural resources preservation work along the Blue Ridge Parkway was aimed at putting forward a largely mythical vision of white Appalachia. There was a notation in some of the early planning documents, the superintendent, that they were going to open great picture windows on Appalachian life and history, by which the early planners of the Parkway really meant white history, but there's Black history everywhere. A few sites along the Parkway where you could talk about some of these histories. And these are things I'll say that I don't know a ton about any of these histories, but there's been research done. There are places marked. There are physical resources that could help you talk about that, about Black life, work, and community. And there are surely many more. At the Meadows of Dan in Virginia, there has been an actual marker placed on a cemetery that has held the graves of enslaved people related to and owned by the Langhorne family. This was dedicated a few years ago. It's covered in the press, and here's a photograph from the Roanoke Times about that dedication of that marker at that site. Additionally, there are other cemeteries. There are numerous, over 50 cemeteries, I believe, on the Parkway grounds, and these are inventoried on a particular website. But highlighted on this particular site is a site called the Reynolds Cemetery at Pine Spur in Virginia that also is a Black cemetery. So there's many places where you could talk about those lives, those communities, and the people who are laid to rest at those sites. But you could also talk about histories of Black land ownership, farming, and self-sufficiency. And one site that's interesting there is shown here, the Saunders farmhouse at the Peaks of Otter in Virginia. This structure, as far as I know, still stands. There has been park research conducted about it. The picture I have here is from 1977, but this was connected to 3 generations of a Black family that purchased land in this big, relatively big community that was in place prior to the creation of the Peaks of Otter recreation area. And one member of this family may have worked at the hotel that was ultimately displaced by the Parkway at that site. So there's a story there to tell as well. And then thirdly, I've pictured here the Flat Top Manor, the Moses Cone estate at Moses Cone Park. And I know the Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation has worked quite a bit there. And you could talk about the Black employees, domestic employees who served the Cone family at this site. So these are just some examples of things we can say. The second area to focus on is National Park Service planning and development or not of facilities for Black visitors. And this relates strongly to my opening slide about Dalton Park. In the archives, at both in Asheville and in Washington, you will find many references as well as preliminary plans and drawings from the 1930s and 40s that clearly show that Blue Ridge Parkway planners were anticipating developing segregated separate facilities for Black travelers. This planning process is mostly not interpreted along the Parkway, although we did see this relatively new sign shown here at Cumberland Knob that does talk about this. And the sign points to, it's probably too small for you to read, aspects of a 1939 kind of arrangement that the Parkway leadership made about how they would plan for Black visitors, where they would have joint facilities, where there would be separate facilities. And at Cumberland Knob, there apparently were a small area of 5 picnic tables that were reserved for Black visitors. This was not to be marked, but rangers were to tell Black visitors where they would be able to go. So we could talk about this at some length. That story about park planning for Black visitors is largely, as I say here, a story of mixed signals, stillborn plans, and uninterpreted remnants. As I mentioned on the previous slide, there was a kind of confused policy announced by the park leadership in 1939 that reflected a national mixed signals about how segregation and integration would be handled that came from the Department of the Interior and the National Park Service in Washington. There is a lot of work going on about these larger policy discussions now in Virginia. A scholar by the name of Aaron Devlin is working on a project related to Virginia sites. At the national level, you had internal debates within the Department of the Interior and the Park Service between Harold Ickes, who was the Secretary of the Interior, and fairly progressive on racial integration. He had been involved with the NAACP and was very crucial to getting the arrangements made for Marian Anderson to sing at the Lincoln Memorial. But other leadership within the Park Service, particularly Arno Kammerer, who was NPS director at the time, weren't as progressive on these issues. That said, the Park Service had an advisor in Washington, a man whose last name was Trent, who was an African-American man who was an advisor on African-American affairs. But in this period, 30s, 40s, NPS basically decided that they would bow to segregation in states that had Jim Crow segregation laws. They would allow that to go forward. They would allow separate, they said equal, but they weren't always facilities to be planned for and developed. And so there are a lot of plans that happened that seem to be headed in that direction for Blue Ridge Parkway at the time. The slide here features a planning image for Pine Spur. This was going to be a major, completely separate recreation area planned for Black travelers in Virginia. As you can see by the slide, the plans were pretty elaborate: cabins, camping, trailer camp, picnic grounds, a coffee shop. But the planning massively outpaced development. I will note that this plan dated from 1940. A year before this plan was developed, the Lewis Mountain area had opened in Shenandoah as a recreation area completely designated for Black visitors. But in the Blue Ridge Parkway, the planning outpaced development. And ultimately, all that happened at Pine Spur was it's almost laughable, is this, which is some swings and some picnic tables. Even this infrastructure was later taken out. So planning, the planning was never, things were never put into place on the ground at the level that the planning indicated. And so on the ground, we're right back to this woods picnic area at the Bluffs or Doughton Park, which is probably the most elaborate site that was actually built out that was intended for Black travelers. The picture here is the parking lot area in 1940. And this was before the coffee shop was built. Here we have a picture of the same comfort station that I showed on the main slide, built in 1942, but abandoned in the 1960s. This photo was 1976. And then, as you see where I started today, the photo of how it looks as of the fall. And then here are a couple photos for if you go now, what you would see. So the coffee shop is straight ahead in the parking lot photo. And there are different staircases that go down into the woods picnic area along this rock wall. And then you would see as you get there, not only the comfort station, but many abandoned and collapsed picnic tables, fire pits, and other infrastructure. As I mentioned earlier, many facilities were planned that were going to have separate areas for Black visitors. If you go through the archives, you'll see them mostly in Virginia at Otter Creek, at Fisher's Peak, which is now where the Music Center is, at Rocky Knob, at Smartview. For the most part, they were not built. And this largely had to do with the fact that World War II came. Since the plans were just getting underway, World War II came and most development on the Parkway was stopped. And by the late 1940s, the Park Service had gotten clear that it was abandoning official sanction of segregation within park facilities. So that's interesting because I did find a newspaper article shown here from 1957 that suggests that another round of conversation may have ensued about integrated or segregated facilities sponsored in the national parks in the 1950s. For those of you that are park knowledgeable out there, you may know about the Mission 66 project. A lot of things were proposed, more visitor facilities. This article indicates that that alarmed people, white people in Virginia. Somebody should look into that. I don't know a lot. Okay, third big topic is Black labor on the Blue Ridge Parkway. I won't linger long here, except to say that an all Black CCC camp was located on the Parkway 1940 to 42 near Galax, Virginia, doing landscaping work. And then additionally, we find materials in the archives that show Blacks working on road crews. And also then by 1973, we have several photographs in the archives of Ranger Willie McDaniel. I do not know anything about his story, but somebody should look into, the first African-American park rangers on the Parkway and what their experience was like. Finally, we unfortunately need to attend to the Parkway as a space that is also associated with whiteness, the idea of white supremacy, the idea of white Appalachia, as I mentioned earlier, which dominated early cultural resources planning, and strong connections between various individuals who were extremely prominent in white supremacy in North Carolina, and white supremacy political movements in North Carolina were also strongly connected with the Blue Ridge Parkway. I have a former student and colleague who I think is on the call today, named Cheryl Dawn, who's interested in working on this some more, and I'm hoping that she and I will be able to work on this topic together. But I'll just mention here several individuals. Harriet Clarkson was a Supreme Court justice in North Carolina. He was from Charlotte, and he developed the Little Switzerland development. He was a leader in the white supremacy movement out of Charlotte and in around the 1890s, at the point when white Democrats in North Carolina forcibly and with threats of violence basically passed a number of measures that excluded Blacks from politics in North Carolina for 65 years after that. Harriet Clarkson was involved in white supremacy clubs and the red shirt movement in Charlotte in the 1890s. Similarly, Josephus Daniels, shown on the right, who was a hero of the early Parkway story in terms of bringing the Parkway to North Carolina, was a leading voice in promoting white supremacy from the pages of the Raleigh News and Observer, which he owned and edited in the 1890s, same campaign that Clarkson was involved in. And then similarly, Hugh Morton, who owned Grandfather Mountain, was the grandson of Hugh McRae, who was a leader in the Wilmington coup of 1898. So there are some connections and stories to be explored there with regard to significant involvement of really major leaders in North Carolina white supremacy also involved with the Parkway. And then I'll end here with this. There's a student project that I highlight on this page, Highways and Byways of the Past, Women's Groups and Memorial Forests Along the Parkway. I would commend that to all of you to read, but there is a Confederate monument on the Blue Ridge Parkway. It's near the Devil's Courthouse. It is a memorial forest of 125,000 trees planted and sponsored by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, dedicated in 1942 with a speech in Asheville by Josephus Daniels. There was a marker that was reinstalled in 2001. I do not know if that marker still stands, but it is shown on the slide here. In conclusion, I'd like to say that to not talk about Black history on the Blue Ridge Parkway is a conscious choice. And to not talk about how ideas of whiteness are also embedded or written upon the Parkway landscape is also a choice. And if we want to make the Blue Ridge Parkway a truly inclusive space, which we do, I do, we need to acknowledge those things. We need to talk about all of them, because even if we don't talk about it, these histories lurk just out of sight, and they continue to affect and shape how we and many others experience the Parkway today. So that concludes my formal remarks. I will stop the screen share, and I think I might have time for a question or two.
Thank you, Anne, so much. I appreciate that and your insights. And it seems like there is much more to be done and more to research. So we did have a few questions that came in, and feel free to send in a question through the Q&A box if you still have some thoughts coming out. We had a question before we even started. Were there any places on the Parkway or near the Parkway that were listed in the Green Book?
That's a great question, and I'm glad this was actually sent over beforehand. So what Rita is talking about in the questioner is talking about is a publication that was published from the 1930s into the 1960s, I believe, called the Negro Traveler's Green Book. And it was a guidebook for Black travelers to find hotels, restaurants, garages, gas stations, beauty parlors, other facilities that would serve them with respect and dignity across the country. And so it had state by state listings. And so I did go, and these have been digitized in recent years. The amazing availability of digital materials is assisting this research dramatically. They're digitized and available. And there has been work looking at what sites were listed in North Carolina. The North Carolina African American Heritage Commission has worked on that. So yes, there were Green Book sites that were sort of close to the Parkway in North Carolina. Most all of them were in Asheville. And pretty much no other listings in the mountains significantly. And I did check in the 30s, 40s, and 50s listings for North Carolina in the Green Book. There were quite a few listings in various places in Virginia that were closer to the Parkway, which again would comport with the sizable Black populations in those counties. So you had listings in Roanoke, and the Lewis Mountain site in Shenandoah was listed in several, in Stanton, in Lynchburg, and Danville, many other places like that. But so there would have been some places to travel. You'd have to correlate that to when the Parkway was open in particular areas. But yes, there were some limited listings, more in Virginia than in North Carolina. Thanks for that question.
Along those same lines, we have had a couple folks ask us if we're going to be sharing these slides and sharing research. Anne has provided lots of links to some of the research she's already mentioned in the presentation, so we'll be sharing that when we send out the link to the recording of the webinar. We also had someone ask if the map of the sites that you created could be shared.
I can do that. Yes, I can make that possible. I work with the foundation staff to add that to the list of things they'll share.
Great, thank you very much. Let's see, we have a few other questions coming in. Do you know if there were any sundown towns along the Parkway?
That is a wonderful question, and I can't answer it. I would be shocked if there weren't, but Jim Lowen has done a book on sundown towns, and Lowen, L-O-E-W-N-E-N, I think, and that would be the first place I would go to start looking for that.
Great. We've also had some questions about the plans for the future and if there are any significant plans for interpretive programs on the Parkway. I will just say that the Parkway Foundation in our work is taking a look at what we can do to tell a better diversity of stories and take on projects that reflect the history of the Parkway and all of the history of the Parkway. So I'm not going to give specifics on NPS plans right now or what they have planned, but we are taking a very good look at this, and Anne's research is a very good guide, and her insights have helped us a lot in thinking about this topic, and we continue to keep working on it.
Yeah, I'd love to see something like that happen, Rita. And, you know, I think some it would benefit to put out some calls to folks for other materials and memories, photographs, images, anything that people across the region might have.
And I completely agree. We are going to send out a link to the webinar, and in it will also include a link that allows you to share your own stories, or even if you just have a little bit of information about a site and would like to know more, we'd love to have that on our radar so that we can do some research on our end or pass it along to the appropriate people so that they can get it on their radar as well. So it looks like we're at time. So I would like to thank everyone for coming, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation and look for the link in your mailbox soon.
Thank you all. Thank you to the foundation, and thank you to all. I see several of my friends and colleagues who've attended today, and I'm so grateful that you came. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.